There comes a moment in every connection where silence speaks louder than love ever did. Not the loud, dramatic silence of anger, but the quiet, final withdrawal of someone who once gave you their soul. When an empath goes quiet, it's not confusion, it's clarity. It's not weakness, it's awakening. And if you're not paying attention, you'll mistake their silence for patience, when in reality, it's the end of everything you took for granted. There is a profound truth many fail to understand until it is too late. Not all endings come with closure, arguments, or dramatic exits. Some endings arrive in silence, soft, unannounced, yet final. And when an empath, a soul who once poured endlessly into you, becomes quiet, understand this deeply. It is not the beginning of distance. It is the conclusion of effort. An empath does not simply wake up one day and decide to withdraw. No, their silence is built over time. It is crafted through nights of overthinking, days of feeling unseen, and countless moments where they chose to understand you instead of expressing themselves. They are not people who give up easily. In fact, they are the ones who stay longer than they should, love harder than they are loved, and forgive more than they ever deserved to endure. But even the deepest oceans have limits. Avoidant psychology operates from fear of vulnerability, fear of dependence, fear of being truly seen. And so, the avoidant distances, withdraws, and creates emotional gaps where connection once lived. Not always intentionally, but consistently enough to wound. They believe space protects them, not realizing that it slowly erodes the very bond they once valued. And the empath, they notice everything. They notice the delayed replies, the lack of presence, the emotional unavailability masked as independence. But instead of reacting, they adapt. They shrink their needs. They silence their voice. They tell themselves, maybe I'm asking for too much. And in doing so, they begin the quiet process of detachment, not out of anger, but out of survival. This is where wisdom enters, because an empath's silence is not weakness. It is divine alignment. It is the moment they choose themselves after abandoning themselves for too long. It is when their soul whispers, enough, not in resentment, but in clarity, not in hate, but in truth. You see, divine principles teach us that what is not nurtured cannot grow. Love is not sustained by one person's effort. It is not meant to be chased, begged for, or proven repeatedly. Real connection flows. It does not drain. And when that flow is broken, repeatedly, the empath begins to withdraw, not loudly, but completely. Here is the painful irony. The avoidant often realizes the depth of what they lost only after the silence becomes permanent. When the messages stop, when the presence fades, when the person who once tried to understand everything no longer tries at all. But by then, it is not distance. It is detachment, and detachment is sacred because when an empath detaches, they are not playing games. They are not testing you. They are releasing you fully, spiritually, emotionally, completely. They have already mourned the loss while still standing beside you. They have already felt the absence while you were physically present. So when they finally go quiet, understand this. It is not sudden for them. It is the final step of a long internal journey. A journey where they chose peace over confusion, self-respect over emotional chaos, and truth over illusion. So if you ever find yourself in the presence of an empath who has gone quiet, do not mistake it for calmness. Do not assume they will return. Do not believe you still have time, because silence, in its deepest form, is not emptiness. It is closure. And by the time you hear it, it is already over. Avoidant individuals often carry a silent storm within them, a deep unconscious fear of emotional closeness that shapes how they experience love, connection, and vulnerability. On the surface, they may appear calm, independent, and even self-sufficient, but beneath that exterior lies a protective mechanism built over time. This mechanism is not random. It is usually formed through early experiences where emotional expression was either unsafe, dismissed, or unmet. As a result, they learn a powerful internal rule. Closeness leads to discomfort, and vulnerability invites pain. Because of this, when love begins to deepen, something within them resists. It's not that they don't feel, on the contrary, they often feel deeply, but those feelings trigger an internal alarm. The more real the connection becomes, the more their instincts push them to retreat. This can show up in subtle ways. At first, delayed responses, emotional unavailability, or a sudden need for space. Over time, it can evolve into distancing behaviors that confuse the other person, especially someone who thrives on emotional connection. What makes this dynamic so complex is that avoidant individuals are not consciously trying to hurt anyone. In their mind, they are maintaining balance, protecting their sense of self, and avoiding emotional overwhelm. But in doing so, they unknowingly create a cycle where love is given but not fully received, where connection is initiated but not sustained. They may enjoy the presence of someone deeply caring, yet struggle to meet that same level of emotional openness. There is also a paradox at play. Avoidants often desire connection just as much as anyone else, but they fear losing themselves within it. They associate intimacy with dependency and dependency with a loss of control. So even when they find someone genuine, someone who offers understanding and patience, they begin to pull away. Not because the connection lacks value, but because it feels too real, too exposing. This push and pull dynamic can be incredibly painful for the other person involved, especially an empath who naturally leans into emotional depth. The empath moves closer, seeking understanding and harmony, while the avoidant steps back, seeking distance and safety. The more one pursues, the more the other withdraws. It becomes a silent dance of unmet needs, where both individuals are acting from their own internal conditioning rather than conscious intention. Over time, the avoidant may start to rationalize their behavior. They might convince themselves that they need more space, that the relationship is too demanding, or that something is missing. But often, what they perceive as a problem in a relationship is actually a reflection of their own discomfort with closeness. Instead of addressing the fear, they create distance, believing it will restore their sense of control. However, this strategy comes at a cost. Each time they push love away, they reinforce the very fear that drives them. They miss opportunities for deep, meaningful connection, not because those opportunities don't exist, but because they feel unsafe embracing them fully. And in that avoidance, they unintentionally hurt those who genuinely care for them. Understanding this does not excuse the behavior, but it brings clarity. It reveals that the avoidance is not a lack of feeling, but a lack of emotional safety within oneself. It shows that the distance is not always about the other person, but about an internal struggle that has yet to be healed. True transformation begins when this pattern is recognized. When the avoidant becomes aware that their instinct to withdraw is not protection, but limitation, that real strength is not found in distancing oneself from love, but in learning to stay present within it. Because love, in its highest form, is not meant to feel like a threat. It is meant to feel like home. Empaths are often described as people who feel deeply, but that description barely scratches the surface of what they truly are. They are individuals who don't just experience emotions, they absorb them, understand them, and often carry them as if they were their own. When they love, they do so with a rare intensity, offering not only affection, but also patience, compassion, and an almost spiritual level of understanding. They listen beyond words, they notice what is unspoken, and they give without constantly measuring what they receive in return. In the beginning of any connection, this depth can feel like a blessing. The empath creates a safe space where the other person feels seen, accepted, and valued. They are willing to adapt, to compromise, and to meet the other person where they are emotionally. If the other person is distant, the empath becomes more patient. If the other person is confused, the empath becomes more understanding. They believe in the power of love to heal, to transform, and to bridge even the widest emotional gaps. But there is a quiet truth that often goes unnoticed. Empaths have limits too. The difference is, their limits are not loud or immediate. They do not explode at the first sign of neglect or inconsistency. Instead, they endure. They try to make sense of things. They give chances, again and again, hoping that their effort, their loyalty, and their emotional presence will eventually create balance in the connection. They tell themselves that love requires patience, that people need time, and that understanding is more important than reaction. While they are giving, they are also observing. Every unmet need, every moment of emotional absence, every time they feel like they are the only one holding the connection together, it all registers within them. They may not voice it immediately, but they feel it deeply, and with each experience, something inside them begins to shift, slowly and silently. What makes this process so powerful is that it is internal. The empather does not always announce their pain. They don't always demand change. Instead, they begin to adjust their expectations. They start pulling back their emotional energy, not out of anger, but out of necessity. It is a form of self-preservation that develops after realizing that their depth is not being met with the same level of care. And when that realization becomes clear, truly clear, something changes permanently. An empath does not withdraw halfway. When they reach their emotional limit, their detachment is complete. It is not a game, not a strategy, and not a temporary reaction. It is a decision rooted in self-respect. After giving so much of themselves, after trying to hold on to something that required two people, they finally accept a truth they can no longer ignore. Love cannot survive where it is not equally nurtured. This is why their silence carries so much weight. It is not the silence of confusion or indecision. It is the silence of clarity. By the time an empath stops expressing, stops explaining, and stops trying, they have already gone through the entire emotional process internally. They have already questioned, analyzed, hoped, and even grieved, all while still being present. So when they finally step back, it feels sudden to the other person, but for them, it is the final stage of a long journey. There is also a sense of dignity in how they leave. Empaths rarely create chaos on their way out. They don't seek revenge or validation. They simply remove their energy, their presence, and their emotional investment. What once felt warm and constant becomes distant and unavailable. Not because they stopped caring instantly, but because they chose to stop abandoning themselves. And this is where their true strength is revealed, because it takes immense courage to walk away from something you deeply cared about. It takes strength to accept that your love, no matter how genuine, cannot fix what the other person is not willing to face within themselves. And it takes wisdom to understand that staying in a one-sided connection is not loyalty. It is self-neglect. So when an empath withdraws completely, it is not a failure of love. It is the awakening of self-worth. It is the moment they choose peace over emotional exhaustion, balance over imbalance, and truth over illusion. And once they reach that point, they do not look back, not because they feel nothing, but because they finally understand everything. Silence is often misunderstood, especially in a world where people are used to noise, reactions, and constant expression. When someone becomes quiet, it is easy to assume they are playing games, seeking attention, or trying to manipulate a situation. But when it comes to an empath, this interpretation could not be further from the truth. Their silence is not a strategy. It is a shield. It is not meant to control others. It is meant to protect what remains of their inner peace. An empath does not choose silence lightly. In fact, their natural state is openness. They are the ones who communicate, who try to understand, who ask questions, and who make space for honest conversations. They believe in resolving things through connection, not distance. So when that same person begins to withdraw into silence, it signals something much deeper than frustration. It reflects a turning point within their emotional world. Before silence arrives, there is usually a long period of effort. The empath speaks, explains, reassures, and tries to bridge the emotional gap. They express how they feel, often more than once, hoping that clarity will lead to change. But when those words are dismissed, minimized, or left unanswered, something begins to shift. They start to realize that communication without mutual understanding becomes exhausting, that expressing themselves without being truly heard feels like pouring energy into an empty space. This is where self-protection begins. Instead of continuing to expose their emotions to a place where they are not valued, the empath starts to pull back, not out of spite, but out of necessity. They recognize, often painfully, that their vulnerability is no longer safe in that environment. And when vulnerability feels unsafe, silence becomes the only place where they can regain control over their emotional well-being. This silence is not passive, it is intentional. It is the empath choosing not to engage in cycles that drain them. It is them stepping away from conversations that lead nowhere, from patterns that repeat without resolution, and from dynamics that require them to constantly overextend themselves. In this sense, silence becomes an act of self-respect. It is a boundary that says, I will no longer give my energy where it is not received with care. There is also a quiet strength in this decision, because for an empath, staying silent can be more difficult than speaking. They are wired to connect, to express, to reach out. So choosing not to do those things requires discipline and awareness. It means resisting the urge to fix, to explain again, or to hope that this time things will be different. It is the moment. Hey, stop trying to change the other person and stop protecting themselves instead. To someone on the outside, this silence might feel cold or confusing. They may wonder why the empather has suddenly become distant, why the warmth has disappeared, or why the effort has stopped. But what they fail to see is that this silence is not sudden. It is the result of everything that came before it. It is built on moments where the empath felt unheard, unseen, or unappreciated. And once that silence settles in, it changes everything. Because the empath is no longer engaging from the same place. They are no longer investing their emotional energy in the same way. They are observing more, speaking less, and slowly detaching from the connection, not to punish the other person, but to reclaim themselves. It is a quiet withdrawal that signals a deeper realization that their energy is valuable and not everyone deserves access to it. This is why their silence should never be mistaken for manipulation. Manipulation seeks control over others, but an empath's silence is about regaining control over themselves. It is not about making the other person react. It is about no longer reacting to what harms them. In its deepest form, this silence becomes a form of healing. It allows the empath to reconnect with their own needs, to process their emotions without external interference, and to rebuild the sense of self they may have neglected while trying to hold the connection together. It creates space for clarity, for strength, and for truth. So when an empath becomes silent, it is not because they have nothing to say. It is because they have finally understood that not everything needs to be said to be recognized, and more importantly, that their peace is worth more than being heard in places that never truly listened. There is a quiet and often painful irony woven into the dynamic between avoidance and deep emotional connection. The very thing that is pushed away is the thing that is later missed the most. Avoidant individuals, driven by an internal need for space and emotional safety, tend to create distance when closeness begins to feel overwhelming. In those moments, they convince themselves that stepping back will bring relief, clarity, or control. And for a time, it does. The silence feels manageable, the independence feels empowering, and the absence of emotional intensity feels like peace. But that peace is often temporary and misleading, because what they create in that distance is not resolution, but absence. And absence has a way of revealing truths that presence can sometimes hide. When the empath, who once filled the space with warmth, understanding, and emotional depth, is no longer there in the same way, something begins to shift internally. The avoidant starts to notice what is missing, not immediately, but gradually, in moments they didn't expect. It might be in the quiet of a normal day, when there is no message waiting. It might be in a moment of stress, when there is no one offering calm understanding. It might be in the realization that no one else quite listens, cares, or connects in the same way. These are the moments where awareness begins to surface, not as a sudden revelation, but as a slow and undeniable recognition. The connection they once had was real, and more importantly, it was rare. But by the time this realization fully forms, the dynamic has already changed. The empath, who once tried to maintain the bond, has likely reached a point of emotional withdrawal. Their energy is no longer available in the same way. Their presence is no longer constant, and their silence, which was once filled with unspoken hope, has now become a reflection of acceptance. This is where regret often enters, not always expressed outwardly, but felt deeply within. The avoidant may begin to replay past interactions, noticing things they once overlooked, the effort, the patience, the consistency. They may recognize how often the empath chose understanding over reaction, how many times they stayed when leaving would have been easier. And with that recognition comes a difficult truth. What they once had was not ordinary, and it was not easily replaceable. However, the challenge lies in timing, because realization does not always come when there is still an opportunity to repair. Often, it arrives after the emotional door has quietly closed. The empath has already processed the loss, already grieved the imbalance, and already chosen to move forward. So when the avoidant begins to feel the weight of what is gone, they are no longer meeting the same version of the person they once knew. This can create a sense of confusion. They may wonder why the empathy seems distant, why their attempts to reconnect are not met with the same openness. But what they are experiencing is not rejection in the way they once feared. It is the natural consequence of a connection that was not sustained when it mattered most. There is also an internal conflict that arises. The avoidant may feel the desire to reach out, to reconnect, to rebuild what was lost. But at the same time, their old patterns of fear and hesitation can still be present. This creates a tension between what they now understand and what they are still struggling to overcome within themselves. And this is where growth becomes essential. Because recognizing the value of love after it is gone is not enough on its own. It must be followed by a willingness to confront the very patterns that led to its loss. Without that, the cycle simply repeats: connection, distance, loss, and regret. The deeper lesson here is not about blame, but about awareness. Love can not be appreciated only in its absence. It must be recognized, nurtured, and reciprocated while it is still present. Because once it reaches the point where silence replaces effort and detachment replaces hope, the opportunity to experience it in its fullest form may no longer exist. So when the avoidant finally understands what they had, they are often faced with a truth that is both humbling and heavy, that some connections are not lost because they were weak, but because they were not protected when they needed to be. And by the time their value is fully seen, they have already slipped into memory, where appreciation can no longer change the outcome. Emotional neglect rarely announces itself in obvious ways. It does not always come through harsh words, dramatic conflicts, or visible rejection. Instead, it operates quietly, almost invisibly, through absence rather than action. It is found in the moments where attention is missing, where effort feels one-sided, and where emotional needs are consistently overlooked. And because it is subtle, it is often misunderstood, both by the one experiencing it and the one causing it. For someone with a deeply feeling nature, like an empath, emotional neglect does not go unnoticed. Even when nothing is explicitly said or done wrong, they can sense the imbalance. They feel the lack of presence, the inconsistency in communication, the emotional distance that grows over time. But instead of immediately labeling it as neglect, they often try to rationalize it. They tell themselves that the other person is busy, stressed, or simply needs space. They give the benefit of the doubt again and again because their instinct is to understand, not to accuse. This is where the quiet damage begins. Because while they are making excuses and extending patience, their own emotional needs are slowly being unmet. Conversations become shorter, less meaningful. Effort feels uneven. The warmth that once existed begins to fade, replaced by a sense of uncertainty. And yet, the empath continues to show up, hoping that things will return to how they once were. What makes emotional neglect so harmful is not just what is missing, but how consistently it is missing. It is not one forgotten moment or one distant day. It is a pattern. A repeated experience of feeling unseen, unheard, or emotionally disconnected. And over time, that pattern begins to shape how the empath feels about the connection. They may not express it immediately, but internally, something begins to erode. The sense of security weakens, the emotional bond feels less stable, and the effort required to maintain the connection becomes heavier. What once felt natural now feels forced. What once brought comfort now brings confusion. And still, the empath tries, because that is who they are. They believe in the potential of the connection, in the possibility that things can improve, that awareness will come, that effort will be reciprocated. But emotional neglect has a cumulative effect. Each small moment of disconnection adds up. Each instance of feeling unimportant leaves a mark. And while none of these moments may seem significant on their own, together they create a weight that becomes impossible to ignore. The empath begins to feel emotionally exhausted, not because they stopped caring, but because they have been caring without being equally cared for. This exhaustion is not loud. It does not always come with confrontation or anger. Instead, it shows up as quiet withdrawal. The empath starts to speak less, expect less, and invest less, not out of bitterness, but out of depletion. They realize, often painfully, that continuing to give in the same way will only lead to further emotional imbalance. There is also a shift in perception that takes place. At some point, the empath stops focusing on what the other person could be and starts seeing what they consistently are. The hope that once fueled their patience begins to fade, replaced by a clearer understanding of reality. They recognize that emotional neglect, even if unintentional, still has consequences. That love cannot thrive in an environment where it is not nurtured, no matter how strong the initial connection was. And this realization changes everything. Because once the empath fully understands that their emotional needs are not being met, they can no longer ignore it. They can no longer convince themselves that things will magically improve without real effort. And most importantly, they can no longer justify staying in a situation that slowly diminishes their sense of self. This is when the breaking point is reached, not through a single event, but through a gradual accumulation of unmet needs and unspoken pain. Yet even in this breaking point, there is a form of awakening. The empath begins to reclaim their emotional energy. They start to prioritize their own well-being, to recognize their own value, and to understand that love should not feel like constant effort without return. They learn that being patient does not mean tolerating neglect, and that being understanding does not mean accepting imbalance. So while emotional neglect may seem quiet on the surface, its impact is profound. It has the power to slowly dismantle even the strongest emotional connections, not through conflict, but through absence, not through rejection, but through inconsistency. And by the time its effects are fully realized, the damage has already been done, not in a dramatic ending, but in a quiet transformation where love fades, effort stops, and the person who once gave everything finally chooses to give no more. There is a common belief that loss happens in a glee moment, that it arrives with a final conversation, a clear decision, or a visible ending. People often associate loss with the day someone walks away, the moment the relationship officially ends, or the last message that is sent. But the deeper truth is far more subtle and far more profound. Real loss does not begin at the end. It begins long before that, in the quiet shifts that go unnoticed, in the small disconnections that slowly reshape the bond. Loss, in its truest form, is a process. It starts in moments that seem insignificant at first, when attention fades, when effort becomes inconsistent, when emotional presence is replaced with distance. These moments don't immediately signal an ending. In fact, they are often dismissed or overlooked. One person may sense that something feels different, but instead of addressing it directly, they try to adapt. They become more patient, more understanding, more willing to carry the weight of the connection. This is especially true for an empath. Rather than confronting the change with resistance, they respond with deeper effort. They try to restore what is slipping away, often without realizing that they are the only one trying to hold it together. And while they are doing this externally, something very important is happening internally. They begin to feel the absence of what once was the consistency, the emotional depth, the mutual energy. At first, this feeling is subtle. It shows up as a quiet discomfort, a sense that something is not quite right. But over time, it grows. The empath starts to notice patterns, conversations that lack meaning, moments that feel disconnected, and an overall shift in how the relationship feels. It is no longer as alive as it once was. The warmth is fading, replaced by uncertainty. This is where the real loss begins, not in separation, but in disconnection. Because once emotional calm, discussion starts to weaken, everything else follows. The bond that once felt natural begins to feel strained. The effort that once felt effortless becomes something that requires constant maintenance, and the joy that once existed in the connection starts to diminish slowly but steadily. What makes this phase so significant is that it often happens silently. There may be no arguments, no dramatic confrontations, no clear indication that something is ending. From the outside, everything may appear normal, but internally, the empath is already processing the change. They are already feeling the loss. Even though the relationship has not officially ended, they are grieving something that is still physically present, but emotionally fading. This is a deeply complex experience because it creates a gap between what is seen and what is felt. The other person may not fully recognize what is happening. They may believe that everything is fine, or at least manageable. But the empath knows, on a deeper level, that something essential has been lost, and once that awareness becomes clear, it cannot be undone. From that point forward, the empath begins a quiet process of detachment, not all at once, and not with intention to hurt, but gradually. They start to invest less emotionally. They stop expecting the same level of connection. They begin to accept that what they once had is no longer being sustained, and in doing so, they prepare themselves for an ending that has not yet been spoken. By the time the final goodbye arrives, if it even comes in words, it is no longer the most painful part. The real pain was already experienced in the gradual loss of connection, in the slow realization that something meaningful was slipping away without being restored. And this is why true loss feels so quiet, because it is not defined by a single moment, but by a series of moments that lead to the same outcome. It is not loud or dramatic, but steady and undeniable. It is the accumulation of everything that was not addressed, not nurtured, and not protected. Yet within this quiet loss, there is also a deeper lesson. It teaches that connection must be maintained with presence, not assumed with time, that love requires consistent care, not occasional attention, and that what is left unattended will eventually fade, no matter how strong it once was. So when the end finally becomes visible, it is not the beginning of loss, it is the confirmation of what has already taken place. A quiet ending to a quiet unraveling. A final step in a journey that started long before anyone realized it was already over.